The body, consumed by fever, trembles in wild rhythm. Frailty turns every breath into torment, while the stifling Babylonian heat presses on the chest, thick and nearly unbreathable. Inside the stone halls of the palace, where once commands echoed that shaped the destiny of continents, now hangs a suffocating stillness, disturbed only by the shuffle of sandals and strained gasps. The air feels so heavy it seems the walls themselves have soaked in the reek of spilled wine from past revelries and the damp of soaked fabrics laid out to ease the ruler's relentless fever. The contrast is so striking that it is hard to believe before us lies not some unknown sufferer, but the man whose very name for centuries embodied unconquerable might. His campaigns once shattered kingdoms, his eyes summoned armies, his steps opened paths no people of the West had dared tread. Yet now the frame that once seemed the image of unending vigor lies confined to a bed. With each passing day, less remains of the famed endurance, replaced only by growing helplessness. Those entering the chamber feel torn by two emotions. Before them lies not just their sovereign but a figure long regarded as divine. That makes the sight before them even harder to bear. For if even the conqueror who crushed the mightiest army of his age can now lie weak and motionless in his own palace, then what boundary exists for human strength? This is no sudden ruin, no instant fall. It is a slow torment where each hour becomes another round of the body battling itself. The air is thick not only with heat but with dreadful anticipation. What will happen if the breath that still holds together the empire finally stops? Thus begins the tale of Alexander's final days. A story where the glow of triumph and the shine of myth clash against the harsh truth of decline. And from the very start it is clear this is not simply the tale of a great conqueror's death, but of the gulf between the image of a god and the reality of a man imprisoned in failing flesh. He was born in Pella, Macedonia's capital, on a July day in 356 BC. Even then, accounts from his era speak of omens many took as signs of divine favor. Some thought them chance, others swore they proved the infant was born not merely as dynastic heir, but as a figure destined to be remembered for centuries. The boy grew within a world of legends and soon became part of them. His body was vigorous and firm, his features sharp and striking, and his eyes, according to ancient writers, could sway crowds with a single glance. Alexander never resembled an ordinary prince. He carried himself as though already shielded by the hidden guardianship of the gods. His training prepared him not for courtly routine, but for conquest. His tutors were the wisest minds of his time, chief among them Aristotle, whose teachings gave him not only reason but a hunger for knowledge of the wider world. From the philosopher, the young heir inherited curiosity for the nature of things and for the peoples he would subjugate. Yet even such knowledge he turned into a weapon, an insight into rivals, foresight of their fears, and mastery of their weaknesses. When his father was slain and the 20-year-old suddenly ascended the throne, he showed neither confusion nor hesitation. His figure seemed forged for command. Already by then in Greece and far beyond, whispers spread that Alexander was born as a living symbol of dominion. Though he had yet to achieve any great feat, he appeared already as the man armies would follow and kings would kneel before. His youth was not weakness, but the forging of a legend. And within this legend, the breath of eternity was sensed from the start, as though it could not finish like the destinies of simple mortals. He took the crown not as a youth, but already as a shaped commander. The first months of his rule became a trial that proved to the world that before them stood not only an heir, but a man ready to redraw the map of all the known lands. Hardly had he seized power when he confronted unrest in Greece. The cities, long used to a fragile balance between Macedonian control and their own proud autonomy, thought the death of Philip gave them a chance to shake off their bonds. But Alexander reacted with speed like lightning. His soldiers marched south, and soon the walls of the stronghold were leveled to dust. That act was itself a message understood by all. The young monarch would not tolerate weakness and was prepared to crush anyone who questioned his might. After that, no city in Hellas dared to rebel again. Yet for Alexander it was only the beginning, a burning urge to pass beyond the borders of the ordinary world. Within 2 years, he carried his army across the Hellespont and entered the dominions of Persia, the greatest empire of that time. None dared challenge its supremacy, yet Alexander advanced with the certainty of one who already knew the result. Battle followed battle. At Granicus, his troops hacked a path through the river, where the enemy's greater numbers seemed unassailable. At Issus, he routed an army several times larger. And at Gaugamela came the clash later remembered as the turning point of an age. The king of kings, Darius, abandoned the field, and the gates of Babylon and Persepolis opened before the Macedonian. Still Alexander pressed onward, as if understanding itself was never enough. He climbed into Bactria's highlands, crossed the passes of the Hindu Kush, and drove his warriors into India, where even myth spoke of no roads. Cities bearing his name sprang up one after another. Kings and nations bent the knee. Yet most of all, he remained not just a commander, but a comrade to his soldiers. He shared their rations, walked in their dust, and led their charges in person. His vigor appeared without end, his presence almost divine. To the troops he seemed a figure poised between human and God. By 30, he stood as the man whose renown had filled the world entire. It felt as if no force could ever bring his march to a halt. And for that reason the later downfall appeared all the more dreadful. The loftier the summit, the deeper the chasm into which one must fall. Late spring, 323 BC. Babylon glittered with lights, filled with noise, preparing for another campaign. Alexander, full of ideas and ambitions, was already planning routes to Arabia, ordering ships to be readied and information gathered about lands his troops had never touched. At that moment, no one could guess that the countdown of his earthly life would begin at a feast. The banquet of his companion Medius Laureus seemed like nothing special. Cheerful talk, music, and wine. But already that night, something unusual struck Alexander. Suddenly he felt a sharp pain in his stomach and a heat that spread across his whole frame. At first, it could be taken for fatigue or the result of the feast, for he had endured far harsher trials before. Battle wounds, long marches, hunger, and cold. Yet this time his body answered differently. By dawn he could hardly stand. His knees bent, and his whole body burned with unbearable heat. He was carried to rest, and from then on he never rose without help. It started with what no one in camp or palace could explain. Some thought it was an illness from the marshy ground, others whispered of poison, and some even spoke of divine punishment. But one fact was clear. From that night on, Alexander was no longer the man his warriors knew. The one who had led them into combat and marched the desert by their side could now hardly lift his hand. His voice grew weaker each day, his frame heavier and still. Meanwhile, unease grew beyond his chamber doors. Generals gathered in corridors, trading glances and brief words. The empire stretching from Egypt to India rested on one man, and now this man, who only yesterday was plotting new conquests, lay in bed unable to rise. With every new attempt by doctors to ease the fever, it became plain that no baths, no vigils, and no prayers would restore his power. Slowly Alexander himself, not yet broken, began to see his struggle was not with enemies but with his own flesh. The days dragged painfully on. The fever stayed, the body wasted, and his breath turned labored, as though every breath was its own battle. Alexander, once the first to march and to charge, could not now rise without support. The servants tried to hide their fear, yet in their eyes it was plain what they dared not voice. They helped him sit upright, adjusted his pillows, brought water. But they knew that the man who once led the army through deserts and mountain passes was no longer before them. Behind the chamber doors, the noise only grew. Generals gathered in clusters, spoke in half-tones, their words breaking off whenever anyone from outside appeared. Each step in the corridors resembled predators circling prey still alive but already weakened. No one spoke openly of the future, yet all knew that once the breath ceased in peace, the struggle for power would flare. At times Alexander ordered himself moved toward the exit to see the troops, but even such brief moments brought shock. Soldiers, long used to the image of an endlessly strong and tireless leader, now looked on him pale, bent, and cloaked. He did not speak aloud, only lifted his hand faintly in greeting. The warriors marched past, bowing low. Many barely held back tears. It was like attending a living funeral. Thousands of men were saying farewell to the one who had given them the greatest victories. They knew their commander was present, but he was no longer the same. And in this silence, among the sweat, heat, and steep corridors, Alexander was trapped in a body refusing his command. He, once master of an empire, could not even master his own breath. A heavy, almost unbearable stench filled the rooms. The burning sun heated the clay walls of the palace, which themselves became sources of fire, turning the chamber into a trap. The curtains over the windows brought no ease, holding only the smell and dampness. The linen sheets, soaked in sweat, clung to Alexander's skin, and whenever they were replaced, the fresh cloth was instantly wet. The doctors tried every method they knew. They lowered him into cool baths, rubbed his skin with herbs, gave him wine mixed with bitter infusions. When that failed, they turned to prayers and charms, but the fever returned, as though mocking them. Some healers already feared to act with more resolve. In Macedonia, the king's failed treatment could mean not only disgrace, but death for the physician himself. So some chose to wait, others withdrew, unwilling for their name to be tied to the illness's end. The nights were hardest of all. The oil lamps cast golden flickers on the ruler's face, and in that uneven glow his features seemed sharpened by pain. He sank into stupor, then opened his eyes again, summoning his kin with a gesture. They sat beside him, unable to find a word. Loud speeches vanished, commands were gone, and only the hoarse breath with the rustle across the stone floor remained. At times he asked to be taken to the river, where the fleet was readying for a fresh campaign. There, wrapped in a cloak, he stared motionless at the ships, as if wishing with his gaze to continue what he could no longer command. Those nearby understood this was no inspection, no order, but a farewell. Yet no one dared to speak it aloud. The palace had turned into a place of anxious waiting. Each messenger rushing down the corridors kept his face stiff, as if one expression could reveal more than any words. Generals gathered in corners, their voices cutting off at every echo of steps. The empire stretching from Egypt to India now hung on the faint breathing of one man. More and more often, not only loyal friends but also faces behind masks appeared. Some wiped sweat from his forehead with sincerity, while others stayed at his bed only for moments, mostly to be seen. For some this was care, for others it was settling accounts. Alexander could barely utter a word. At times his speech broke into nothing more than a faint rustle, and often he spoke only with the movement of fingers or the smallest nod. Yet even this silence did not strip him of his rule. Each gesture, each look was taken as a sign strong enough to decide the fate of the world. Meanwhile, quarrels arose in the passages. They disputed not about cures, not about easing the king's pain, but about provinces, about armies, about who would hold command next. Some looked to the lawful heir in the unborn child, others inclined toward Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, who might be turned into a pliant figure. The pregnancy of Roxana, his wife, became part of that hidden contest, for she could produce an heir. And above it all loomed the darkest suspicion, poison. The name of Antipater, governor of Macedonia, was heard more and more. His ties, his opposition to Alexander's rule, his household, all this fed whispers. Some claimed the king was given a rare root that caused slow decay. Others said it was invention, that the sickness was natural. But the very existence of suspicion made the air heavier. Anyone in the hall could be ally or conspirator. Silence reigned above Alexander's weakness, but impatience thundered outside his doors. All knew that once the heart grew still, none could preserve the state's unity. And so, in every glance and step, greed for the coming days was felt. The ruler, bound to his bed, had become a helpless mirror reflecting the fears, ambitions, and hopes of all around him. In those last days his movements were barely seen. Breathing grew uneven, but his mind seemed clear. Those near swore that Alexander heard every word, understood each phrase, but lacked strength to reply. And in this silence, legends began to arise. Some said that at the limit of his strength, he removed the seal ring from his hand and handed it to Perdiccas, a quiet but obvious sign of confidence. Others told that when asked to whom he left power, he whispered, "To the strongest." These words at once turned into a source of endless arguments. What did they imply? A call for honest contest, or a cold permission for bloodshed to come? Some believed there was no answer at all, that it was only a later tale, created to justify the wars that soon began. Whatever the truth, the myth followed its own path. Every detail, every motion of Alexander took on meaning. For some, the ring showed the choice of a successor, for others it was a challenge cast by his commander. But one fact was clear. The moment of his departure would become not only a personal grief, but also a signal for the start of a new age, the age of struggle for his heritage. And so, in early June, the heat reached its height. The air inside the chamber felt as if frozen. No one tried to deceive themselves. The end was near. The soldiers he once led through deserts and mountains now gathered to bid farewell. He was laid upon stretchers and carried before the ranks. Thousands of warriors passed in silence, bowing, many with tears in their eyes. They touched his hand, unable to speak. It was the last parade of his army, yet not as its leader, but as its emblem. The empire itself held breath. It seemed as though history was waiting for the instant when his eyes would at last close. All around, the palace, the people, froze in uneasy balance, knowing the next moment would decide the fate of continents. The hour struck, and the breath at last ceased. But instead of the end expected, something else began. Something that gave birth to the darkest legends. In the suffocating Babylonian heat, Alexander's body did not change. One day passed, then another, then a third, but decay did not appear. For the soldiers and those who came, it seemed a revelation. He was not only a man, he belonged to the realm of the gods. For scholars and physicians of later times, this remained a riddle still lacking a clear answer today. The ancients spoke of wonder. Writers of that time said it was proof of his divine essence, a prize for victories and hardships. Yet even in antiquity, rational voices raised questions. Could it be that doctors used special mixtures for short preservation? Or was everything caused by the nature of the illness? Modern scholars suggest he may have suffered a rare disorder of the nervous system, when the body lies paralyzed, but the mind remains aware. In such a state, a man may seem dead, though life still warms within him. If this version holds, then Alexander passed his last days in full awareness, hearing every word spoken near his bed, but unable to move a single finger. To imagine such a fate is more dreadful than any battle. A commander used to ruling thousands could only follow with his eyes as those around decided who would seize power, not even able to blink in protest. For his soldiers, the incorruptible body was a marvel. For his enemies, it became a reason for new rumors. For later generations, it was a mystery that only strengthened the glory of his name. While the body held its form, the strain around it grew sharper each day. Only the chosen were allowed to remain nearby. Physicians and priests worked under constant watch. Every gesture, every glance was noted and gave birth to guesses. Now Alexander was no longer just a symbol of triumph, but a prisoner of his own legend. His body had turned into a treasure worth more than an army. The form that once inspired might and terror had now become the chief prize in a political game. It was consecrated with every ritual. Cloths, myrrh, and incense filled the chambers, mingling with the heat of summer air. Egyptian masters or local artisans opened the cavity, filled it with spices, shaping the vision of an incorruptible king. All was carried out under constant vigilance. To make a mistake meant not only to damage the body, but to call down the anger of the troops and the people. Then the greater question arose. Where should Alexander's final rest be placed? In Macedonia, his homeland, where his ancestors lay, or in Egypt, the conquered land turned into a mark of his might? Disputes flared without end. During this time, Perdiccas, made regent, ordered the raising of a vast catafalque, a moving shrine adorned with columns, gilded statues, and scenes of victories. It was meant not simply to carry the remains, but to show each city on the route that it was not the ashes of a man, but the divine sovereign worthy of worship who was passing by. This structure took years to complete, and when the procession at last began, it resembled imperial display more than a funeral march. Slowly and solemnly, to the sound of horns and drums, the caravan moved through the cities, each of which was forced to bow before it. Yet Perdiccas's design collapsed. In Syria, Ptolemy, governor of Egypt, made his clever strike. He seized the procession, persuaded the guards, and carried the body away. This capture became the decisive moment. Ptolemy knew that to control Alexander's body meant to control his inheritance. Indeed, thousands of warriors hastened to Egypt, seeing in it the guardian of their king's memory. Perdiccas, shamed, marched with his army against his rival, but met not triumph, only mutiny and death. Thus the body, turned into a symbol, finally broke the empire apart. In Memphis, Ptolemy placed Alexander in a sarcophagus, even using the tomb of the last pharaoh, Nectanebo II. Later he moved the remains to a new city, Alexandria, making it the core of his authority. There began the cult. The conqueror king became the eternal protector of Egypt. In Alexandria, the ruler's body stood at the center of a new order. Ptolemy and his heirs knew that holding this shrine made their rule legitimate. So we find ourselves in the hall called Soma, in the very heart of the city. There, among columns, statues, and endless ceremonies, Alexander continued to reign in another form. His name was spoken in prayers, pilgrims came to his tomb, and Ptolemy built his power upon the cult. Centuries rolled by, then more. Every new king of Egypt strove to link himself with this greatness, and the Romans, when they reached Alexandria, could not resist either. Julius Caesar and Octavian Augustus, mighty leaders and emperors, came to honor the body of the one whose fame still eclipsed their own. The tomb became not only a place of memory, but a stage of political spectacle, where all longed to touch Alexander's immortality. And still, nothing lasts forever. The final reference to his sarcophagus comes from the 4th century AD. After that, the trail vanished. Some wrote of the mausoleum's ruin during violent earthquakes, others of a secret burial to shield the remains from the masses. Medieval tales claimed the body was taken to Constantinople, to Venice, or even concealed in the Scythian steppes. Yet no report was ever proven. To this day, archaeologists and historians still dispute. Some think the sarcophagus lies hidden beneath the streets of the modern city, covered by the weight of centuries. Others were sure it had been carried away and hidden elsewhere. Searches lasted for decades, but each new clue ended abruptly, leaving the riddle unsolved. The irony was that the man whose name was known from Greece to India had himself become part of the mystery. His resting place dissolved with time, turning into legend. For some, it became an unreachable aim of archaeology. For others, it was proof that even the greatest ruler cannot govern fate after death. The greatness built by campaigns was finally opposed by the silence of the bed where he passed his last days. Statues, coins, and bas-reliefs showed him forever youthful and mighty, a hero with godlike profile. Yet reality told another truth. The body, broken by wars, sleepless nights, and heavy wounds, could no longer endure. And in this gap between the image and the reality lay the deepest lesson. Even he, called invincible, was bound by human weakness. The myth of the eternal sovereign faded around his chamber. The generals no longer saw a half-god before them, only a man whose body failed against illness. But this fragility became the turning point. When the illusion of immortality collapsed, the empire itself began to fall. His last act, whether the gift of a ring or the words about the strongest, turned into the spark that lit an entire age of wars. The realm built in 10 years was dragged apart by his heirs for decades. Macedonia, Egypt, Asia, each fragment turned into its own kingdom, and blood was spilled in ceaseless strife. The irony was that his greatest creation did not outlive him. But Alexander himself did not vanish. He became an eternal emblem. He endured in legends, in the cities that bore his name, and in the mystery of the vanished tomb. He turned into a myth that lives on where history left emptiness. And perhaps it was meant to be so. He did not depart in the cry of battle, did not fall beneath an enemy's blade. He left in silence, and in that silence he became everlasting. In death he found not an ending, but another kind of immortality in the memory of humankind.